All right, today we are going to take a whirlwind tour of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which lasted from 1954 to 1975, so over 20 years. There, you could teach a whole class on the Vietnam War and how it happened and how the U.S. got involved and what the impact has been. But we're going to spend about 2 days on it, so this is going to go pretty fast. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, and as you can see, this lecture is a little longer than they usually are. So let's talk about how the Vietnam War even happened. You may recall that the French colonized what they called Indochina beginning in 1858. The goal was to bring civilization to this particular part of South Asia. After World War I, before even World War II, a leader named Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader named Ho Chi Minh, started fighting the French for Vietnamese independence. When the French were invaded by the Nazis during World War II, Japan saw this as an opportunity and invaded Vietnam as well. When World War II ends and Japan surrenders, the US gives aid to France to attempt to recolonize this part of the world, specifically Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh continues to fight against the Japanese and now again against the French to keep the French out. You may recall that after World War II, during World War II, Roosevelt advocated for self-determination of self-controlled nations. But by the time Truman takes office, after Roosevelt dies, he is more and more concerned about a spreading communist threat. So he decides to make some different choices than Roosevelt may have made. We don't really know. By 1953, the French are losing badly to Ho Chi Minh's forces, which are called the Viet Minh, and they lose a very big battle in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. 8,000 French troops are killed, and the French basically withdraw. The French ask Eisenhower to send troops and help and intervene on behalf of France. And Eisenhower declines, partly because the U.S. is already involved in the Korean War, and he doesn't want to have two simultaneous conflicts. Plus, he feels like he's learned a lesson from the Korean War. After the French withdraw, an international conference at Geneva is convened, and Vietnam is divided in two at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam is controlled by Ho Chi Minh's nationalist forces. South Vietnam is controlled by Ngo Dinh Diem, a French-educated Roman Catholic. The South becomes the Republic of Vietnam, and the North is Communist Vietnam. There's Ngo Dinh Diem. A date is set for democratic elections to reunify the North and the South. At this time, there's a lot of popular support for the North Vietnamese Communist Party and for Ho Chi Minh. So Ngo Dinh Diem recognizes that he's going to lose the election, and so he backs out. And this is actually what creates the conflict between the North and the South. 9,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, known as the National Liberation Front, march along what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try and basically invade South Vietnam and reunify the country by force. During this time, the U.S. continues to sort of grow their support for the South Vietnamese government, despite the fact that Diem is a pretty repressive dictator. His family holds all the power. The wealthy, small group of wealthy people, basically hoard all the money. And then there's a Buddhist majority in the country that is persecuted by Diem and his family because, as we know, they are Catholic. This persecution is pretty bad. They are tortured. There's basically no political freedom. Despite all of this, because we see communism as the greater threat, the U.S. continues to provide aid to Diem's government. Eisenhower sends financial aid and military aid in the form of just 675 U.S. Army advisors throughout the 1950s. He does not send in troops because he does not want to get dragged into another major armed conflict. This changes in a few years. You may recognize this picture. This shows a Buddhist monk committing what's called self-immolation. He sets himself on fire on a crowded street. This happened in 19 the early 1960s. A 73-year-old monk sets himself on fire and basically like becomes a martyr. Um, Instead of letting up, Siam's government basically declares martial law. Things start to shift when Kennedy is elected in 1960. Important context here for why Kennedy makes the choices that he makes is that he's coming under a lot of criticism, even just as he's elected, for being too lenient on the communist threat. I know it's easy for us to look back and think about this like threat of communism as this boogeyman that was really blown out of proportion. But you have to remember that the lessons of World War II are really fresh in people's minds. World War II had ended only 15 years ago. The United States had invested a ton of time and energy and soldiers and money into fighting a fascist dictatorship. They viewed the spreading threat of communism from China and from the Soviet Union as another fascist dictatorship. So Kennedy wanted to make sure that he was appropriately fighting this threat. He had already come under criticism for allowing the Berlin Wall to be built and for allowing communism to spread to Cambodia and Laos, very close to Vietnam. So Kennedy starts to increase the military advisors. He sends in the Green Berets, a team of elite soldiers, and he increases the advisors to 16,000. So obviously at this point, we're not just advising, we're actually fighting. In 1963, JFK supports a Vietnamese military coup d'etat in order to get rid of Diem and his brothers. He does this because he realizes that Diem, as such a repressive dictator, is a liability to the US. It doesn't look good for us to be supporting him. Plus, he's continuing to alienate the South Vietnamese. The coup results in the brutal murders of Diem and his brother, and then Vietnamese generals overthrow one another. A relatively stable, but unfortunately still pretty tyrannical government emerges. It's a little bit better than Diem's, but not much. The other unfortunate part of this is that 3 weeks after this military coup d'etat, Kennedy is assassinated. So whatever plans he had are basically thrown out the window as Johnson takes office. So Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president after Kennedy is assassinated. Similar to Kennedy, Johnson is very concerned about being criticized for allowing the communist threat. He remembers that Truman was criticized for allowing China to become communist, and he says, "I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went." He revives this idea of the domino theory, the idea that if one country falls to communism, and then another country will fall, and another. And just as we had seen this happen sort of in Eastern Europe and had started to happen in Asia, there was concern that we just couldn't let Vietnam be the next one to go. Things start to come to a head in 1964 when a U.S. naval ship called the USS Maddox is fired upon by the North Vietnamese. This is a little tricky because the Ho Chi Minh claims accurately that he did not order the U.S. to be fired upon, that it was basically a mistake, like a rogue soldier. At first, Johnson says that a second attack will have to happen in order to retaliate. However, he gets advice from his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who becomes very famous for his involvement in getting the U.S. sort of entrenched in Vietnam. He is advised that he should fight back. So for the first time, American pilots drop bombs on Vietnam. This becomes known as the Tonkin Gulf Incident. Johnson claims that the attacks on the United States were unprovoked, and that's why we have to fight back. This leads to something called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in Congress, which is essentially a blank check for a president that allows the president to put troops on the ground in a foreign country without congressional approval. This is really important because remember that Congress, according to the Constitution, is the only branch of government that can declare war. The president can't. But this sort of gives Johnson a workaround, as well as future presidents. The result of this, as you can see, is that the number of troops deployed to Vietnam increases exponentially throughout the 1960s. So that by the time we get to 1968, over 500,000 troops are actually in Vietnam fighting. This begins the ground war throughout Vietnam. There's a lot of problems with the ground war. One of them is that the US doesn't have any concrete territorial goals. We're not actually fighting to capture specific pieces of land. We're basically just trying to keep the North Vietnamese out of South Vietnam as best we can. But there aren't tangible goals that soldiers are going for. Another problem is that this is really the first time that there's a TV in everybody's living room. So it's the first war that gets televised. People see how awful it looks. You can see these are reporters like following some soldiers in Vietnam, and people can see that American soldiers are dying every day, which obviously doesn't help American morale or opinion of the war. The Viet Cong, Ho Chi Minh's troops, are getting supplies from the Soviet Union and from China over what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So the United States starts to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the beginning of the air war. In 1965, the US launches Operation Rolling Thunder, which is basically the first sustained bombing of North Vietnam and lasts about 3 years. Again, really targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail as an effort to break up the supply chain to the Viet Cong. This is also the beginning of carpet bombing using napalm, which is a gelatinous form of gasoline that burns your skin off once you come into contact with it. By 1966, over 2,000 American soldiers had died, and the North Vietnamese controlled 2/3 of South Vietnam. So we hadn't really accomplished anything in terms of gaining any ground. The problem with the carpet bombing in particular is that it didn't distinguish between civilians and military in Vietnam. So the US bombed with napalm a lot of civilians, including, as you can see, children. This raises an important question. It's really hard for the US to tell who the enemy is in this war. The Viet Cong are made up of some, professional soldiers, but also people who are farming by day and then fighting guerrilla warfare at night. Also, the Viet Cong are willing to accept a lot of casualties. It's sort of a war of attrition, and the US does care about casualties. So it doesn't really seem to matter how many Viet Cong they kill if an equal number of Americans are also dying, or even a much smaller number of Americans, which is the case. In 1967, Johnson sends General Westmoreland in. Westmoreland claims to everyone famously that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Because of this, he asks Johnson for thousands and thousands of men, which Johnson goes ahead and sends, even though Johnson's advisors are telling him at the same time that the war is completely unwinnable. Even though Johnson is being told this, the American public is told repeatedly that victory is just around the corner and that the Americans are winning. The president knows this isn't true. His advisors know this isn't true. The military advisors know this isn't true. American soldiers are spread too thin over Vietnam, so any ground they gain is quickly lost. Again, it doesn't really seem to matter. North Vietnamese soldiers are quickly replaced once they are killed. All of this comes to a head with the Tet Offensive in January 1968. So, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacks 100 different cities and bases, as well as the US Embassy in Saigon simultaneously. At first, 60,000 troops attack. By January 30th, a brief ceasefire is declared, but then the next day, 84,000 North Vietnamese troops attack. This is interesting because for the first time they're attacking in cities, which actually gives the US and the South Vietnamese forces an advantage. For the first time, the US can see who they're fighting. They're not fighting in the jungle, so they actually have the upper hand. This is a decisive military victory for the United States. However, it doesn't feel that way at all to the media. Remember that the American people had been being told every day that America is right on the edge of victory. It's very clear then, when the North Vietnamese attack with thousands and thousands of troops, that this isn't the case, right? So, of course, people get upset when they start to realize that they're being lied to. 58,000 people are killed during the Tet Offensive. You can see in this corner this picture of LBJ, famous picture of LBJ taken after the Tet Offensive in the White House. People start to turn against him. You start to hear this cry at anti-war demonstrations, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" His approval rating drops from 48% to 36%, which for some context is about as low as Trump's approval rating ever got. At the end of March 1968, Johnson announces that he will not seek re-election for president, making him essentially a one-term president. He says, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." He also announces that they would stop bombing North Vietnam in an attempt to get North Vietnam to come to the negotiating table. At this point, the United States is more divided than it had been since the Civil War in terms of lots of things that are going on, like racial tensions, as we've discussed, as well as these political tensions around whether or not we should be in the war. The Republican candidate, remember Johnson was a Democrat, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, wins the presidential election in 1968 with his campaign slogan, "Peace with Honor." Nixon argues that the majority of the United States population actually does want to be in the war in Vietnam. He appeals to what he calls the silent majority, and he says that they will win the war, but they will do it with honor. However, a couple of important things happen here. One is that during the election, Nixon reaches out to the South Vietnamese, or Nixon's advisors, reach out to the South Vietnamese and encourage them to walk away from the negotiating table because he says that if he is elected, he will be harder on North Vietnam than Johnson is being. So the South Vietnamese actually walk away. For a presidential candidate to intervene in foreign policy like this is illegal. And LBJ finds out what happened. But he doesn't say anything. He can't tell the public because his source is a CIA wiretap, and he doesn't want to reveal that. So he can't say anything. He chooses not to say anything, and Nixon wins the election anyway. Rather than pulling the United States out of Vietnam, Nixon actually expands the conflict. We invade Cambodia and Laos, and also start to use Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant which causes major long-term effects and diseases for millions of Vietnamese people, as well as thousands of American veterans. As a result of all of this, morale among Americans really starts to dip. Remember that in 1968, both Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated and Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated while campaigning for president as a Democrat, once Johnson says he will not seek re-election. For the first time in the war, there's a disproportionate representation of poor people and minorities in the armed forces. This is partly due to the fact that more privileged people, usually white people, found ways to avoid the draft. Additionally, within the Army, there's blatant acts of racism occurring that cause division and dissension, and some major drug problems among the soldiers fighting overseas. As morale is falling among the American public, we become more and more aware that perhaps we are the enemy rather than the Viet Cong. During World War II, it was really clear that the United States was fighting fascism. They were fighting the Nazis, who were doing really horrible things to people. In Vietnam, this becomes less clear. Were the people using napalm? Were the people using Agent Orange? And then, in 1968, the My Lai massacre occurs, when a battalion of US soldiers goes into a village and massacres 200 to 500 unarmed villagers, women, children, just everyday people, for no apparent reason. When this becomes public, obviously, the American people are devastated and continue to ramp up their anti-war protests. The most famous anti-war protest happens on Kent State University's campus on May 4th, 1970. The National Guard is called out to put a stop to the peaceful protests, and 4 students are shot dead and 11 students are wounded. 6 days later, the same thing happens at Jackson State University. 2 students are killed, 12 are wounded. Anti-war protests spread all over the country, mostly on college campuses. People are burning their draft cards, trying to go to Canada, trying to get away. The University of California at Berkeley is one of the most famous protests. And then there's also violence breaks out between police and protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. Later this week, we'll talk about Watergate. But sort of the beginning of part of the Watergate saga is the revelation of the Pentagon Papers. A former defense analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaks government documents to the New York Times. Now, these government documents contain decisions that were made during the Johnson administration, which show definitively that the government told the American people that we were in Vietnam to stop communism, when actually we were just there to avoid defeat, and that we were no longer intending to try to stop communism. This leads to a famous court case in the Supreme Court, New York Times versus the United States. They end up ruling with New York Times, despite the fact that it is a government document, can in fact publish it, and this sets a precedent later on that will affect Nixon. In 1972, the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger announces that peace is at hand. However, North Vietnam attacks the South, and the most massive bombing yet to happen commences. In 1973, a ceasefire is signed between the US, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. The conditions are not particularly favorable to the US. The US has to remove all troops. North Vietnam leaves its troops in South Vietnam, and it becomes really clear that North Vietnam is going to resume the war as soon as the United States is out. No provisions are made for prisoners of war or soldiers that are missing in action. The last American troops leave South Vietnam at the end of March 1973. By 1975, North Vietnam has invaded and completely defeated South Vietnam. The capital city of South Vietnam, Saigon, falls in 1975 and is renamed Ho Chi Minh City, at which point many South Vietnamese who were loyal to the US attempt to flee because they are afraid of persecution. These famous pictures of the US citizens in Saigon boarding a helicopter at the end of April 1975, as Saigon has fallen to the North Vietnamese and they are afraid of being captured. The cost of the Vietnam War is enormous. 3 million Vietnamese are killed. 58,000 Americans are killed and 300,000 are wounded. The cost of the Vietnam War desperately hurts the economy. It causes 11% inflation, and unemployment during this time rises to 12%. Remember you read about LBJ's Great Society programs. Well, there simply just wasn't enough money to go around to fund both this war and his programs. $150 billion were spent fighting in Vietnam. Perhaps more importantly, US culture is definitively impacted as the US government self-confidence and trust in government is utterly decimated. Political impacts include the passing of the 26th Amendment, which lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. Nixon also abolishes the draft and creates an all-volunteer army, as we still have today. Lastly, in 1973, Congress passes the War Powers Act, which says that the president has to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying military force. If he doesn't, and even if he does, the president has to withdraw those forces unless he gets congressional approval within 90 days. Nixon vetoes the War Powers Act, but Congress actually overrides it. American prisoners of war return from what's called the Hanoi Hilton, an ironic name for where they were held in Vietnam, including famously future Senator and presidential candidate John McCain. Despite that, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 prisoners of war and soldiers were missing in action, are still unaccounted for. In 1982, the US government decides to erect a war memorial about the Vietnam War. An architect, a relatively unknown architect named Maya Lin, is selected to build the memorial. This was a slightly controversial decision for a couple of reasons. One, she was a woman, and two, she was Asian American. I'm sure you've been to the Vietnam Memorial and seen it. It's incredibly powerful. It has the 58,000 names of the Americans who were killed in the war etched into it, and is also a reflective surface so that people are encouraged to look in it and see themselves as part of the dead. Um, if you've been there, you've probably been there and seen it. It's incredibly striking and looks really different than other memorials within the city, so it really stands out. We're going to come back to a lot of this when we talk about the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, because there's a lot of similarities and people drew a lot of parallels between the two. But when we think about our large essential question of how did we get here, the Vietnam War plays a really interesting and integral part of that in terms of how we think about our military, how we think about who we are, and how we think about the US role in the world. This concludes our whirlwind tour of American involvement in Vietnam. Please complete your exit ticket and have a great day.